So let me start by complaining a little bit. So it's a bit unfair as a mathematician to follow an astronomer, biologist, climate scientist. So what I'll do is I'll cheat a little bit. So I'll show mostly beautiful pictures and data from our collaborators and very few equations. Yeah? So good. Good. Yeah. So when I submitted the title afterwards, I realized so that was actually not about it's not about a Secretary of Health. So that's just that's entirely different arena here. Good. So my group sits in building 2, so at the close to the river. So now it's also called the Simons Building, so after the renovation. But we collaborate with many labs across MIT, and here I have a list of our past and current collaborators. So Matthias Kolle is a colleague. He's in mechanical engineering, and Nektar Fakhri is in MIT Physics of Living Systems department. Martin Swierlein is doing quantum physics here in building 26. Steve Lavelle is doing brain and cognitive sciences. Brady Weisberg is in biology. So they're both interested in neuromechanics or neurobiology. Adam Martin has a lab actually directly to Brady. This is how we got involved in the collaboration. And Adam is interested in developmental biology. And most recently, we also started collaborating with In-Song Kim. He's in political sciences. And yeah, so they give us very interesting data from very different systems. So here I have a few examples. So Matthias' lab here in building 3, so he has developed fibers, elastic fibers that change color when you deform them. So you have a direct optical readout of deformation. So we are interested in modeling those and also in understanding from a mathematical perspective, so how, for example, stress is distributed in knots, and which knots are more stable than others. So Nektar's lab is interested in many things. So one is pattern formation and signaling in cells. So this is oocyte. So this is almost an egg cell, not quite an egg cell yet. And at the very early first stages of development, these oocytes basically have some signaling on the surface of the cell membranes. And what you can see here are the chemical signaling waves that will lead and form the first cell division. So that has happened in our development. So we're interested in understanding these type of phenomena. So what you can see here is an image from Martin Swierlein's lab. So that's not a galaxy, actually. So that's at the totally opposite end of the scale. So that's an image of an ultra-cold quantum gas in a rotating trap. And once you start rotating it, basically it forms these galaxy-like patterns. So we are trying to understand pattern formations in these systems. So next to here, you can see a worm, and I will tell you a little bit more about these guys. And here's a jellyfish. And for both these systems, Steve and Brady have developed machinery to measure simultaneously the neuron activity and also the locomotion and behaviors of these organisms. So what we are trying to build is models that connect these two different scales. And yeah, Adam is interested in development. He's working mostly with Fly, and In-Song is working with tariff data and all sorts of other data. And in the second half of my presentation, I'll give you a slight insight into what we're interested in there. So why can we work with all these different groups? And it's because we speak a common language, and I would say that's really mathematics. And when they give me these beautiful data, all I see is basically this. So everything basically they give me can be cast into the form of a tensor. So if you think of a video, for example, so you could think as a dimension that goes in here as time, and you see a bunch of frames. So we would be interested in finding a model that would allow us to predict maybe from the first 2 frames the rest of the video. So that is enough. But it could also be data that comes in a table form, and we would be interested in predicting basically from part of the data the rest. And so this is a type of task. So one thing we are always interested in is, first of all, to reduce the dimensionality of the data, to reduce this big chunk of data into something smaller, and then we work with these smaller bits and pieces. Now, I have a quiz, so we'll see if it works or not. So it's not. So I was thinking about how I present what we do with these data, and I thought it's maybe a good idea just to give a sequence of classes and to see if you can tell me what these mean. I think most of you have taken at least one of those. Huh? And so the first one, I gave a slight light pointer here, a little bit of help. So which one is that? 06? Linear algebra? linear algebra. So that's really the data and how you reduce the data that we work with. So most of the models that, or the systems we deal with, so they are very high dimensional. So they also include some stochasticity. So we need to know about random variables. And most of the models that we try to develop are stochastic in some sense. So we try to predict probabilities of certain things that happen. So that would be 18600. This is one class that I have taught quite some of it. So which one is it? Differential equations, yeah, differential equations. So this is the prediction part. Huh? So once we have a model, we would like to predict the dynamics. And then there's one here at the very end. Which one is that? Dynamics and control. Huh? So once we have a model, so we would also try to use that model to control, for example, the behavior of organisms. So I'll talk a little bit about this. So yeah, so this is roughly the pipeline. So we start with data, high-dimensional data. We transform it in some way so that it becomes more manageable. We try to infer models. So the models usually take the form of a conditional probability. So given my current state and the state of some control variable, I would like to predict the next change or the probability of that next change. And so that can be usually translated into some differential equations, or it could be a stochastic differential equation, also a partial differential equation that we have to simulate to test our, or to make predictions. Good. Yeah, so I would like to talk about two specific applications. So the first one, so that's not a typo. So that's from the Worm Wide Web. So that's a database that was developed by our collaborator, Stephen Flavell. And so this is all about basically this organism here. So this is C. elegans. C. elegans is a roundworm. It has only 302 neurons, but won at least 4 Nobel Prizes. So that's efficient, yeah? And what you can see here on the right is a part of the brain. So, and the blinking shows you which neurons are active. So here we illustrated them a little bit with stars. So, but I mean, just, yeah. But so the data that we work with is then actually of this type. So here it's processed. So you see 4 selected, so this is a part of the brain. You see 4 selected neuron traces. And here you see the locomotion basically transformed into a co-moving frame so that it's. So our goal would be basically to have a model where when we feed in these type of neural patterns, basically we can predict basically what the motion will look like. So also to go the other way around. So could we predict what's the probability? So given the motion of the worm, could we predict the probability of a certain neuron being active? So that is so the goal here. So ultimately we want to control the worms. So we basically achieved that quite recently. So it was work performed by my PhD student Alex Cohen, who is in the bottom corner. So we have basically a model that predicts the data that we get, and then we can use that model to backend a control framework. So where we solve an optimization problem where we ask how would the neurons have to be active to trace out a certain target, basically motion. So here basically you see different letters, and here's basically how we predict the neurons should be activated. So, and that's a prediction where we stick our neck out a little bit, and so we hope that, so we are now in discussion with Stephen's lab, and I think it's a little bit further out in the future that we can really stimulate several neurons simultaneously, but maybe there's something in between where we can say maybe 1 or 2 neurons we can stimulate in different ways, and then try to test if our understanding works. Good. So this is basically on the worms. So pretty much the same mathematics can be used to understand lobbying data. So, and the database we work with, so that was really based on an heroic effort by In-Song Kim. And In-Song and I, so we got to know each other in MIT daycare. So our kids were best friends. And at some point we were talking about, oh, what are you doing? Oh, it sounds interesting. So maybe we can work together. And that has now happened after 8 years or so. And so what he has compiled a range of databases. And there are 2 that I find particularly interesting. One is related to the world trade. So we have the whole world trade history over the last 20 years, so every country with every country and so on. And the other one I will talk about today is related to political lobbying. So if you want, so you can basically sign up here and then you can access that database. So it's based on publicly available data. But I think maybe the people didn't expect that somebody would actually collect it and curate it in a form. So what's in that database. So in 1995, Congress passed a law that you have to report in principle all political lobbying data in a certain format as a PDF. So on that PDF or paper, piece of paper, you have to note what the topic is you're lobbying on, who you talk to, how much money you spend, and then the people who lobby have to basically write down who they talk to on the governmental level and so on. So there are about, I think now it's 1.2 million records in the database, and it's steadily growing. So these reports have to be filed quarterly. So you have basically 4 time points per year. And the total amount of money basically that was spent on lobbying now has exceeded $100 billion. And one can argue whether that's a lot or not a lot, because it affects really all of the economy. Good. So for every year, so you have these PDF files, so you have to analyze them and transform them, bring them into a format that you can do mathematics with those. But in essence, what you can do, you can take these the information in these PDF files and map them onto a graph structure. And you can do that for every year since basically 1995. So what this graph represents on the left here are the clients. So here, these are firms or individuals that have lobbied in that year on a certain topic. And the color indicates how much money they spent. So we know basically all the names and the amount of money they have. Actually, I was quite a bit worried more recently about basically having that type of knowledge, but last week I was naturalized, so I have now dual citizenship. So I think I can be confident and present that data here. But it's very interesting. So, these are the clients, and so what you can see here in the second part of the network, on the second column, so these are the lobbying firms, and they're split into 2 parts. So there's one part that's called in-house, so the big companies like Google, Apple or so, and Tesla, they can employ their own lawyers that then talk to and initiate lobbying. Or what you can do is you can go to K Street. I didn't know basically prior to the collaboration that actually exists, so that's a street in DC where you have a lot of lobbying firms and they specialize in lobbying and they all have connections and so on. So, and they can funnel their money basically into these different channels. And then these lobbying firms or in-house lobbying firms, they employ lobbyists. So these are lawyers. So these are individuals, so we know them by name because they have to write their name onto these files. And these lawyers then talk to certain governmental agencies, and every interaction basically corresponds here to an edge in that graph. And then in these agencies, you have certain politicians, and what you can see here is whether a certain politician has sponsored basically a law in that area. So that's a huge amount of data. And actually, we have more information also. We know, for example, if the lobbyists have previously interned with a certain government agency and so on. So that's quite interesting. So it's a huge amount of data, and the question is how can we break that down and translate it into a somewhat predictive model, and this is work in progress, so I show you something that's very, very recent. So the first step is here to also reduce the dimensionality of the data. So what we'll do is we will cluster all these groups basically according to certain criteria. So you can choose different criteria, they give you slightly different cluster, but here's one example. So here we have clustered groups according to topics they have lobbied on. And so there's one cluster here that just shows as an example. So it's here labeled oil and gas. And if you look at basically who is in that cluster, you see here ExxonMobil, for example, and then some other companies. And you can do that basically by applying certain clustering methods to text data. So you can do the same for all these different layers. So here we have then certain, also politicians, for example. So here you see different colors. So the colors represent here, for example, politicians that have always basically voted basically for Republicans, and there are some that are always basically leaning Democratic, and there are some in between that have also co-sponsored bills, for example, together with a Republican, so Democrat and a Republican, and so on. So we have all this information. So this is now much lower dimensional, but it also means we have now more data for these clusters, so we can start estimating these probabilities in the same way we were predicting probabilities for worm motions. So what you can see here is, so the probabilities we're interested in are typically of the type, so given, given say some certain topic, like, so what's the likelihood or the most likely pathway basically that activity would take through that network. So in that sense, you could make all sorts of predictions, or you can also go backwards if you want to. And we have that for every year. So you can also study how these networks change and so on. So and this is a huge amount of data, and I think so. The key difference for me is that all the other data sets I presented before, collaborations, they work with experimental data that comes from designed experiments. So this is an experiment we actually live in. So we are somewhat excited about. Maybe excited is not the right word, but now because you have these tariffs basically that are imposed, so you see in a lot of these networks responses. So and how do you do an experiment? You perturb a system and you measure the response. So we have that now live. Yeah, good. So yeah, so this is what I wanted to present. So we're always curious to be offered new data and to think about how we can compress it into some sort of predictive model. So this is something I didn't talk about. It's also very recent. So this is data from the CDC. So I hope that CDC will also still exist for some time. So these are mosquito flight data, and this is a PhD student, not a math PhD student, but a biologist PhD student. And we have three-dimensional tracks, for example, for these mosquitoes, and also in the presence of different stimuli. So what we try to learn here is equations that predict how a mosquito finds its target, and that's also of interest. Yeah, so there are various problems of this type. So for us, they are pretty much the same. So I use mathematics really to talk to many colleagues and learn about many fields. So I wouldn't have learned about otherwise. And as I mentioned, if you have data or know somebody who has data, so feel free to reach out.